I applied to a career development grant so I could experience like another way of like making. So the reason why I did it in Japan is to try and find like another place that was doing similar crafts but in a different way, that had sort of evolved in a different way of making things and doing things, a different sort of aesthetic as well, and like apply that to my work and really broaden my knowledge as well. It was with the Winston Churchill Trust, and it was a travelling fellowship. So they give anywhere, I think, up until like maybe 5,000 to 10,000, and they will sort of like, depending on your project, like what you decide to do. They've got really amazing projects going to the North Pole, going for these huge travelling trips that obviously cost a lot more. And then my trip was in Japan, so it's quite far breadth. Some other people's trips were going all around the world, and some were just like quite local, just like in Europe or something like. But still, like kind of had a very like deep breadth of knowledge going through whatever journeys that they do. So it was very difficult to build a network out in Japan because a lot of the craftsmen, they're not like online, you can't search them, you're using different kind of search engines to kind of find the information about them. So a lot of the time I'd be asking just anyone that I knew, even when I was here in the UK before I went to Japan. I'd be asking friends, I'd be asking other craftsmen, and eventually after about half a year I'd started already kind of building up like a network and a story in which I could go and like search for people. So it was really sort of like a passing of words and things, and really it's kind of trying to like understand crafts and being able to talk to people as well, and you got to always be polite and respectful of everyone's time, and you've also got to know how to not be in people's hair. So, you know, you're just there and like giving some sort of enjoyable experience without having any of the drag of meeting someone new, because you've got to kind of put yourself in their footsteps of like, oh, you know, who is this nobody coming out of here? You've got to kind of give something to begin with. So gifts are important in Japan as well. So formal introduction and gifts and things. So it's good to understand a little bit about a culture before you go about like asking for help. Yeah, I've stayed in touch, yeah, and I've laid down other routes here for other craftsmen in Japan, like some of Hiroshi's assistants would, you know, when they first came to Japan, they'd stay with me, and Shinta, who's next door, he's like Hiroshi's first assistant. He first came here into my studio and I showed him how some engraving, and then he'd do some work for me, and now he's got a studio here just next to me. So he's the first sort of silversmith under the Alexander McQueen Foundation here. And you know, also just having my teachers' kids who are also amazing craftsmen, and Koichi, and we're very good friends, so we talk all the time, sort of reminiscing like, oh, I wish I was working next to you right now. I learned a lot in Japan, like a lot of tool making, so like making the chisels, making like the hammers, making like specialist tools. I did a little bit of everything in Japan, so, you know, hammer raising, just so I could sort of get a better idea of like the craft in general there. And then I sort of honed in on certain skills, and then also just using those tools, you come up with different techniques, different ways of using it. I met up with a lot of young craftsmen who also had come up with their own ways and like methods to develop like their aesthetics and their like processes. My top tip would be to keep their idea very pure, like what they want to learn, and they can try and find that in a very kind of broad area. You know what I mean? Like they can not specifically a very difficult technique, but maybe just because you haven't got that much time. So it would be good to sort of just have a general idea that you can still gain enough from on that trip, because a lot of the other experiences aren't really just a technique or something. It's also the people there and the ideas that will fuel you later on, because that's a lot longer lasting, that will stay with you. Yeah.